Good afternoon. My name is Lilia Boeri, and I'm from the physics department of Sapienza Universita di Roma in Italy. And the talk I will be presenting today was supposed to be given at the March meeting of the American Physical Society in Denver in 2020. And as you probably know, the March meeting was canceled. But I still thought it would be important to share my results with you, to give the message that science is here and better times will come. And I'm very grateful to the Enrico Fermi Research Center, which gave me the opportunity to record this talk. The title of my contribution is Room Temperature Superconductivity in High-Pressure Hydrides. And this is an extremely exciting talk, extremely exciting topic. As you know, this can be seen from many different angles, and the angle that I would like to discuss today, the perspective I would like to give today, is that of a person who has been working in electronic structure for many years, and I will show you that there are many reasons to be excited about this discovery. So what are we talking about? Near room temperature superconductivity in high pressure hydrides. If you read this title, I mean, if you read this title 5 years ago, this would have been unbelievable. Like, people would never have believed that near room temperature superconductivity could be measured in any system. But I mean, as you probably know, like 5 years ago, let's say high TC superconductivity was measured in a very unusual system. And a very unusual system is a high pressure hydride. What does high pressure mean in this context? I mean, when we speak about high pressure, we should actually speak about extreme pressure, because the experiments which we are talking about take place in the megabar range. So we are talking about millions of atmospheres. And these pressures are really hard to reach in a lab. It's only a few years that this can be done. And this can be done using these objects, which are shown here, which are diamond anvil cells. And then, as you can imagine, like, these kind of experiments are not only costly, but they are very difficult to perform. I mean, it's hard to reach this pressure, it's hard to control the synthesis condition, and so on. So when you attempt one of these experiments, it's important to have an idea of the system that one wants to investigate. And this is why actually this whole field is a fantastic example of cooperation between theory and experiment. And I think that, I mean, in order to get to the point where we are now, there are essentially two types of ab initio methods which had to be developed over the years, two classes of ab initio methods. One are methods for crystal structure prediction, like you see here, the sketch of what is called the potential energy surface. So these are methods that permit to explore what is called the energy landscape of materials. And then there are methods for superconductivity, which actually permit to compute now fully ab initio the superconducting property of a compound given the structure and the chemical composition. So if we combine these three things together, we have a way to predict superconductors. Predict superconductors mean predict the chemical formula, the stoichiometry, the structure, and synthesize them. And of course, this whole field would not have started if there wasn't a strong motivation behind. And the strong motivation behind are basically two papers, two intuitions by Neil Ashcroft. The first one is like almost 50 years old, and the second one is a bit more recent. So what can electronic structure teach us about high pressure hydrides? Let's start, as I said, from these two intuitions of Neil Ashcroft. you see there are two papers, two PRL from 68, 2004. The first one is called metallic hydrogen, a high temperature superconductor. Very interesting is the fact that almost at the same time, Ginsburg had the same idea. And then in 2014 and 2004, sorry, there is a second paper where Ashcroft elaborates on his first speculation, and he speaks about not pure hydrogen, but so-called hydrogen-dominant metallic alloys. And he speculates that also these could be high-temperature superconductors. So let's see a little bit how this work or how this intuition work. This is the formula for the critical temperature of a conventional superconductor. It's called Macmillan formula. This gives the critical temperature of a superconductor in terms of essentially three parameters: a phonon frequency, an electron-phonon coupling constant lambda, and a so-called Coulomb pseudopotential mu star. And if we think about hydrogen, there are basically three reasons to think that hydrogen would be a high-TC superconductor. The first one is very simple to explain. I mean, the prefactor of this formula in hydrogen or in hydrogen-rich material would be high, because basically phonon frequencies are inversely proportional to the mass of the element which forms the crystal. So hydrogen is the lightest element. The phonon frequency should be very high. The second factor actually appears in the exponent, is this lambda, is this electron-phonon coupling, and we can further divide it in two parts. I mean, the first part is so-called is N0, N of 0, which is actually the density of electronic states at the Fermi level. So this factor tells me that the more electrons are at the Fermi level, so the more electrons are available for superconducting coupling, the higher the lambda, the higher the TC. Okay, this is simple. Why should atomic hydrogen have high N0? Reason was that at the time when Ashcroft was writing, he was thinking about atomic hydrogen in some kind of BCC, HCP lattice, and this kind of lattices have typically very steep peaks in the density of states. Then the second reason is a bit more subtle. You have this I. This I is constant. Sometimes it's called the formation potential. This is an electron-phonon matrix element. So this electron-phonon matrix element measures basically how much the electronic system is perturbed by the ionic motion. So why should this matrix element be large in hydrogen? The reason is that hydrogen, I mean, there are no core electrons in hydrogen. So this means that the interaction between the nuclei and the electrons is unscreened. So this bare interaction is strong. And as soon as you basically displace the nuclei from their equilibrium position, the electrons feel this displacement and react. And this means that they will have a strong electron-phonon coupling. So we have seen hydrogen. What is the problem with hydrogen? I draw an arrow here, and this arrow should give an idea more or less of the evolution of the properties with pressure. So at the far right end of the spectrum, we have atomic hydrogen. And as you see here, like the pressure that you need to metallize hydrogen, now we know it, it's around 500 GPa. I mean, you would expect critical temperature which are larger than 300 K, so larger than room temperature, but in order to measure this critical temperature, one would have to achieve pressure of the order of 500 GPa. And for a long time, this was considered equally impossible. And there are actually a couple of reports from this year which show that actually we may be almost there. But anyway, in 2004, when Ashcroft wrote this important paper, like 500 GPa was out of question. But what it was possible to achieve was pressures in the order of 1-200 GPa. And Ashcroft's idea was that Well, if one can achieve pressure of 1 or 200 GPa, this may be enough. And the reason is that the pressure that, that hydrogen needs to metallize, part of this pressure could be actually provided by the lattice, what could be achieved from what is called chemical precompression. The idea is that if one mixes hydrogen with some other element, and of course there is a lot of hydrogen and less of this other element, then one would have some kind of hydrogen sublattice with some atom embedded in between, and this atom embedded in between would exert what is called the chemical pressure, like in a sense a physical pressure on the hydrogen sublattice, and thus lower the metallization pressure which is needed to make hydrogen metallic. And we now know that this idea was actually good and it actually worked, and it took around 10 years for the group of elements to measure for the first time high-TC meaning like 200 K in SH3 at 200 GPa, and it took only 5 years to reach what we have now the record, like 260 K in another high-pressure hydride, which is lanthanum H10. So back to the original question. Now that we know that these high-pressure hydrides exist and can be stabilized, what can we learn from electronic structure? So if we look at their electronic structure, the question that we can ask is, what makes them special? What makes them high-TC? What makes some of the compounds more high-TC than others, and so on? The reason we want to ask these questions is that first we want to understand what we have, and once we have understood what we have, we would like to go beyond. And going beyond in this field means essentially two things. I mean, one thing would be to achieve actual room temperature superconductivity, so to measure a material which can superconduct at 300 K. And of course, the second goal, which is like the golden goal, would be to lower the pressure, so to have materials which work similarly to hydrides, maybe still hydrides, but that can superconduct close to ambient pressure. Okay, let's start from the compounds that we know now. Let's start from what we know now. And what I'm showing on this slide is the so-called periodic table of binary hydrides. This is taken from a review that it took almost 1 year for us to write this review. And I think it's a very complete account, not only of the existing discovery, but also of the methods that one can employ to study this system. So if you're interested in this, I really encourage you to read it. Okay. And this is our periodic table of binary hydrides. As you see, it's a standard periodic table. And there are the elements, and a few of these elements are colored, and the elements which are colored are those that form a binary hydride which has some critical temperature in a range between 100 and 300 GPa. Something else about, so you see also a number below the name of the element. This number gives the highest critical temperature. And you see also a color. And the reason why you have all these colors in this table is that at these pressures, there are many, many different hydrides that can form for a single element. So one has what is called forbidden chemistry. This means that when we are at pressure in the megabar range, like elements tend to form many more bonds. There tend to be many more compositions that are stable compared to ambient pressure. One usually, if you know the balance of the element, you can predict what kind of element would form. In many cases here, you have many different binary hydrides which form with different hydrogen contents, and some of these are superconducting, some are not, and we are just listing the one which have the highest TC. If we count all the colored squares, you end up with 61 predicted binary hydrides. These are theoretical prediction. You see that there are a few cases here, yttrium, lanthanum, etc., where the predicted TC exceed 0 Kelvin or exceed also room temperature. And if we look at experiments, as I said before, experiments in this case are complicated. They require a lot of care. There are, of course, many fewer binary hydrides which have been reported to be superconducting. There are a few examples here. And you essentially see that, I mean, you have red and green high TC superconductor. Red high TC superconductors are those which appear in the right part of the periodic table. These are the so-called periodic covalent hydrides, so like SH3 or selenium H3. And then you have a whole class of hydrides on the left part of the periodic table, and then with lanthanides and actinides. And these have much higher, they are much lighter colored, so they have a much higher hydrogen content, and typically they can have also much higher superconducting critical temperature. So what I'm going to do now is discuss the properties of these two classes of high TC superconductors. I will start from covalent hydrides and move on to sodalite clatrates hydrides. So let's start from the compounds which form the lowest pressure. And here we have an example. This is pH3. So this is a compound where the RMS group reported measurements of superconductivity. These are these squares in this plot in 2015. And these are, so the synthesis is similar to SH2, but it's done with phosphine. So the synthesis starts from phosphine. And I mean, the paper reports only behavior of TC as a function of pressure. And what I show here are calculations which are reported in this paper, which show that actually there are several pH composition which actually match quite well the behavior of TC with pressure. And something else that we found in this compound, so I mean from the TC versus P behavior, it was not possible to say what experimentalists were actually measuring. But something which is also very interesting that we understood in this study is that all the phases that we had predicted were metastable, and experiments actually reported that the samples also tended to degrade. So this told us that ab initio methods for crystal structure prediction can predict not only stable composition, but also metastable composition, and that one may be able to see them in experiment. So below phosphine, I mean, it's exciting for this reason, but you see the highest TC is of the order of 100K. And below phosphine, we have the star, so the first really high temperature hydride. And this is SH3. And what I'm reporting here is not the experimental discovery, but actually, which came at the end of 2014, but the first paper which actually predicted what the RMS group observed, so that actually if one mixed in diamond anvil cell H2S, so hydrogen sulfide with hydrogen, with a high enough pressure, one would realize something which would be crazy to see at ambient pressure, and which is SH3. I show here the crystal structure. You see here these yellow balls are sulfur, these small balls are hydrogen, and what you see is a highly symmetric lattice where each sulfur is bound to 6 hydrogen, and you see this is basically the charge, and you see that there is a localization of charge between hydrogen and sulfur, which says that basically in this case we have a covalent bond between sulfur and hydrogen. This is something that should never exist at ambient pressure, but we are not working at ambient pressure. We are working in the megabar range where forbidden chemistry takes place. And here you see what SH3 looks like from an electronic structure perspective. So this is a typical calculation that one would do to predict a high superconductors from first principle. So here you see these are electronic bands, these are phonon dispersions, and here there is a summary basically of the superconducting parameters of this compound. Let's zoom in. I mean, we see that this SH3 actually has all the good qualities of a high temperature superconductor. Phonon spectrum, I mean, you have very high phonon energies, a lot of hydrogen. If we look at the Fermi level, we look here, we see the DOS, we see that this is a very symmetric structure, and indeed you see a sort of van Hove singularity close to the Fermi level. So this means you probably have a large N0, and indeed this also shows that you have a very large lambda. And the very large lambda, I mean, the thing that really explains why you have this very large lambda is this kind of picture where we said before you have these covalent bonds between hydrogen and sulfur. And basically the way in which you realize this large lambda, you understand this large lambda, is that you must imagine that if I move the hydrogens around the equilibrium position, then these bonds, these strongly directional bonds, will distort, and basically a lot of charge, a lot of electrons will move around, and this is shown by this value, this very large value of lambda here. So this is the starting point. If you have the starting point, I mean, the nice thing with the electronic structure is that you can imagine a lot of experiments and try to understand from this experiment. So the first experiment that we did that I'm showing here is one where we said, well, if covalent bonds are so important for superconductivity in covalent hydrides, maybe there is a way to increase the critical temperature, making the bonds more covalent. And we actually found that this is the case. So if one mixes a little bit of oxygen into sulfur, one can increase the critical temperature. If one puts too much oxygen into this structure, actually the structure is destroyed at this pressure because of too strong covalency. There is another kind of isovalent doping that one can think if you have H3S, and instead of replacing sulfur with something else, one can think to replace hydrogen with something else. And the element which is immediately below hydrogen is lithium. And in principle, again, at ambient pressure, I mean, what matters is the valence. Lithium and hydrogen should behave very similarly. With pressure, this is not the case anymore. And the reason is that we said hydrogen is special because it doesn't have core, but lithium has a core. And when you put lithium under sufficiently high pressure, you see the effect of the core. And this is shown here. So this is a sketch of a lithium sulfur compound, which a lithium sulfur, lithium 3S actually, which forms at high pressure, but it's not superconducting. And the reason is that if you look at the charge density distribution, it's completely different from what you see in hydrogen. So you have here charge density localization, not along the bonds, but in the empty voids of the structure. So this is indeed, I mean, turns out that to find a high TC superconductor in this lithium sulfur system, you have to apply much larger pressure and search much harder than with the corresponding hydrogen phase diagram. Okay, so we have seen the first class of superconductors, the covalent hydrides. We now move to the second class. We said this part of the periodic table. These are called the sodalite clatrate hydrides. Lanthanum H10 is at the moment the record holder. And here I'm showing an example of the crystal structure. This is the crystal structure of lanthanum H10. The sodalite clatrates hydrides, they can have a different number here, number of hydrogen. And what they have in common, what all these structures have in common is the basic idea. So you have in the middle a very large element, like an element with a very large atomic radius compared to hydrogen, yttrium, lanthanum, calcium, something else. And then around it, basically hydrogen forms some kind of balls. And then, but then you must imagine that in the lattice, these balls are actually attached to each other. So you have some sort of hydrogen sponge. So this hydrogen, I mean, you must imagine that this hydrogen forms a dense lattice, but then there are a lot of holes in between. Here what I show are the basic superconductivity, basic calculation of the gap of two of these compounds, so of yttrium H10 and yttrium H6 as a function of temperature. I mean, from this you can see yttrium H6 has been synthesized, yttrium H10 has not been synthesized. From this you can see that for yttrium H10 one predicts a critical temperature larger than room temperature. And what is interesting, I mean, one thing is the critical temperature, but one also has to check the stability. And here what we show are calculations as a function of pressure. And as you see, like these curves have a very different extension. And the reason is that yttrium H10 has a high critical temperature, but is stable only at very high pressure, while yttrium H6 is stable up to lower pressure. One can look at the way that basically yttrium H10, yttrium H6 become unstable. And what one finds is that there is basically a phonon mode that drives the system dynamically unstable, which basically means that the lattice is destroyed. And we also found that basically the pressure at which this instability occurs is determined by the radius of the atom that you put inside. So basically by playing with atoms with different radii, one in this kind of cage-like system, one can try to influence at the same time the critical temperature and the range of stability. I move on. So this is basically a summary of what I said until now. So the idea of Ashcroft, how hydrogen precompression in high-pressure hydrides. We have seen we have gone from molecular hydrides like phosphorohydrides to atomic hydrogen, passing through superhydrides, so to more symmetric, more hydrogen-rich systems. And the question is, this is what we understand now about this system, what comes next? I mean, one thing, of course, would be to explore what is left, so to try and synthesize in particular yttrium H10, which should be a room temperature superconductor, same thing for metallic hydrogen. But with this, basically the phase space of binary hydrides is more or less exhausted. But this leaves us with actually a very large playground, which is the playground of ternary and multinary hydrides, where one can think, first of all, to sort of optimize what we understood in the binary system, but also to design new mechanisms for room temperature superconductivity. There is a very nice proposal by the MAC group in the lithium magnesium system, but also try to realize, for example, ITC conventional superconductivity at ambient pressure. I hope I will have some data to show you soon, and also look at other conventional superconductors which could work like hydrides, but at lower pressure. And also in this case, I hope to have soon some material to present. I would like to thank all of my collaborators, funding agency, and I leave you with this slide. So if you would like to learn something more about the activity of our group, you can take a look at my ResearchGate profile, my web page, and here these are these two reviews. And what I would also like to advertise is a conference on challenges in designing room temperature superconductors, which I hope will take place in Italy at the end of July. This is the website. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.